What is the core of why the Agile movement was so successful? I thought back to my time in the Wild West, where I was doing everything. I was doing the analysis, I was doing the design, I was doing the programming, I was doing the testing. As you move up in the organization, the acceptance of Agile has taken longer. It's taken longer with project management than it did with development. It's taken longer with mid-level management than it did with project management. If you can't find at each level of the organization, some of these people that are adventurous and nonconformists, you're going to have a real hard time implementing Agile. We didn't really have an agenda, so when we started, and we didn't have an outcome that we had identified. And then the culture was changing in terms of a reduction of command control and more networking, more collaboration was going into that. There are two sources that have been driving agility, one of which is the Agile movement, and the other one has been management theory in general. It's interesting and ironic, I think, to realize that 17 techies came up with values that really focus first on people and their interactions and collaboration.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our next episode of the Agile Insights conversation. Today I am hosting Jim Highsmith, who is one of the thought leaders in the space of software development and agile methodologies or frameworks. Jim is also one of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto. We will talk about that a bit later. So Jim, welcome to the show. I'm super glad to have you with us. It was actually not that difficult to get you on the show. Thanks for your generosity with regards to your time. And I will immediately hand over to you, Jim, to give us a brief introduction about yourself, as some of our viewers probably don't know you yet. Welcome, right. Jim.
Thank you. I appreciate being here. So I've been at this for about 60 some years, and that's I've been recently given the opportunity or taken the opportunity to sort of reflect on what has happened over those 60 years. And of course, part of that has been my involvement with the Agile movement. And it's hard to imagine that Agile movement is now a little bit over 20 years old. And there are people that I know that are in the profession today that have never done anything except Agile. And I know there's some issues with Agile, and maybe we can get into some of those a little later on. This actually started out, this book I've written on the history, not the history. So it's my history of software development. Started out as a memoir to my grandkids. And it had a very narrow focus. And sort of, as I wrote on it, it expanded into a book. And I would say that my career has been a combination of management and technology. So I've held several different management positions, including head of sales and marketing, which was quite a different job for me, being more in the technology realm. But I've had, manager of software development, VP of consulting, and several other kinds of jobs. So I've really gotten both my engineering background and my management background combined during my career. And I think there was a major pivot point when the Agile Manifesto was developed. So my career took off in a different direction after that, as did a lot of people. So we can kind of get to that. But it's been quite a ride, and I've enjoyed it. And I've particularly enjoyed getting a little bit more involved in the last year or so as I've looked back over the last 60 years and been writing in this book and connecting a little bit more with the Agile community recently.
So thanks, Jim. You mentioned 60 plus years. In some of the other interviews that you've had and the book, I also read that you've been a consultant for 30 plus years. So you have a lot of work experience, both being inside of the organizations, but also bringing an outside perspective to the organizations. And in your book, which is called Wild West to Agile, and I forgot my copy because I usually bring the copy of the book of the author that I'm speaking to, and then I hold it into the camera. Everyone who is listening to this, it's a big recommendation from my side. If you really want to understand, thank you, Jim, for holding up the copy. If you really want to understand how things evolved and that Agile, the way we know it today, did not just appear from nowhere, but there is a context to it. Now, let's start. And you structured the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I might get some of the terminology not correct, Jim. But the first era of the four you called Wild West, right?
Correct.
That's basically the era where everyone is winging it, right?
Right.
There are no structured ways of building software. No, everyone's just starting out. And you mentioned the importance of having a mentor that helps you understand a few of those things and that allows you to speed up or get much faster in doing these things. Then there is the structured era, where basically the waterfall approach comes up, starting out in the end of 1960s, early 1970s, with a paper written by Dr. Winston Royce, working at IBM back then. Then it's the era where we see the foundations of Agile, and then ultimately late 90s, early 2000s, at the latest with 2001, the Agile Manifesto coming up, the beginning of the Agile era. And I want to use this conversation with you also out of personal interest to really get a sense of how those early eras in product development, in software development looked like. So let's start with the Wild West era, which is also to some extent the era where you were still programming on a machine where you were using punch cards, and walk us through the experience of a software engineer back then. For example, when you were working on the Apollo program.
Yeah, my first job out of college, and my degree was in electrical engineering, was on the Apollo program. And so I moved to Florida and worked down there for a couple of years. And it was, I had a kind of a really minor part. But as I tell people, my first project was a success. But, I had a minor part. But I worked on these ships that went out into the ocean and tracked the spacecraft as it came back in, because at that point in time, the communications around worldwide were not that good, and so they were concerned that they would lose communication with the capsule as it came back into the Earth. So that's the part of it that I worked on, and a couple of stories related to that. I worked at Patrick Air Force Base in Cocoa Beach, Florida, and out in front of the building are these life-size rockets of various different kinds, and to kind of show off what's in the building, or what the building is all about, or what the Cape is all about then. And because a lot of the missiles at that point were military missiles, Titan missiles. And so this friend of mine and I were walking into work one day, and, we had our white shirts on and our pocket protectors with all the pins in it. We looked real engineering-like. And we walked up to one of these missiles and started looking around real serious-like, and then started yelling, 10, 9, and ran. And the tourists just took off in all directions. So that's the kind of thing that went on during that era. I left that after I got my master's degree in business and went to work for Exxon doing business systems. And this was an era of the Wild West era. For example, I've got a diagram in the book. On one end, there's a guy sitting there feeding cards into this humongous computer. And on the other end, there's a printer. So that was basically the input-output devices back then. It went from punch cards to printer. And so as I think about it, I ask people today, how would you as a developer or a programmer feel today, or a user of a system, if you hit the enter key and you got the results 12 hours later, which was basically what we did at that point in time. Another example of it was basically the tech stack was the operating system and the compilers. That was about it. And so the way we tested was to run through and get a clean compile, and then we try to actually run with data. And when the program blew up, what you would get would be a core dump of all of core memory in hexadecimal. And that's what you had to decipher to try to figure out what went wrong with your program. So it was primitive. And sometimes I wonder today how we got stuff done, but we did. Another example of how primitive it was, I worked with a guy, his name was Ed, and he was 50-something years old at the time, so he was a real pioneer. And he walked into Ed's office, and there were printouts and card decks everywhere. And in his desk drawer was a stack of card decks that were used for the end of year closing of the financial books. And so Ed took the accounting files and ran it through these special programs to create the accounting books for the year. And if Ed wasn't there, it didn't get done.
Yeah.
So there was no backup for any one of us. So there was the kinds of things that happened back during that period of time. And there were no books on software development. There were a few books on languages, like there was a COBOL book, there was a Fortran book, but there was nothing about software development. And those started emerging in the 70s.
Yeah. There was probably also nothing around project management back then, right?
No.
So
I ran my first project having no idea what I was doing.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I think there's still a lot of project managers that do this today. They have no idea what they're doing. They still do it. Although there's so much literature out there. But that's maybe a topic for later.
Yeah,
now,
one of my quips is there's more written than is known.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So 1969, I think it was 1969, Winston Royce writes this paper. Probably you hear about it back then, or maybe 1 or 2 years later. Everything was not as fast as it is today, as there was no social media, no internet, no nothing.
Right.
But when that comes out, what happens?
Well, there were several people. It's interesting. I interviewed Tom DeMarco and Larry Constantine for the book. And Larry was the person who developed coupling and cohesion. He was the first to talk about that. So he's one of the pioneers of the structured movement. And Larry said that they used to use waterfall as a training mechanism, but that it wasn't useful for real projects. And basically what Walker Royce was saying was he put this waterfall diagram in there, and people glommed onto the waterfall diagram, and in the text he said, but don't use that. But the other thing too...
It's actually, Jim, just 1 second. It's actually right below the image.
Yeah. and so, but you have to realize that was consistent with the times, because you had the nascent project management concepts coming along, and they were all based on building ships and buildings and physical structures. And so waterfall made more sense for those. And so software kind of inherited the waterfall, not only from Walker Royce, but also from the dominant way of going about business during that period of time. So it wasn't just misinterpretation of Walker Royce's. In a different environment, that interpretation probably wouldn't have gone very far. Mm-hmm. And so you combined the structured techniques with waterfall methodology, and you got out of that in the latter part of that decade what I call monumental methodologies, which were huge books, four-inch binders full of charts and diagrams. And so the structured methods by themselves were beneficial, but people tended to overdo it, as they sometimes do today. So I can remember a mentor of mine, Ken Orr, going into an office one time, and the team had data flow diagrams on the wall. All around the walls were data flow diagrams. And they were really proud of their data flow diagrams. And they said, "So Ken, what do you think?" And he says, "I think you're lost."
So this is interesting what you're mentioning, Jim. So for you, the structured approaches or era is not synonymous to waterfall software development, or is it?
No.
No, it's not. So what would be structured?
Structured was a way of looking at different aspects, and it was a little bit waterfallish in terms of how people talked about it, but it wasn't necessarily so in terms of how it was actually implemented. Mm-hmm. Until you got to some of these big methodologies that sort of insisted on a waterfall approach. So the structured techniques were, like, for example, Tom DeMarco's data flow diagrams. That was a diagramming technique to help us understand the business and what was going on in the business by looking at the process and data flow. And it was appropriate, very appropriate for that period of time, because what we were doing was basically automating internal systems. We were automating accounting and finance and manufacturing and order processing, and the basic operational systems of the business were being automated. And so having a technique of diagramming the flow of information was really important. So in that approach, you would do what Tom called a current physical diagram. So you actually look at, Jim gets this piece of paper, he does a calculation, he makes 3 copies, he sends one to Harry, one to Joan, and one to the files, and then Joan takes that piece of paper. And so you actually mapped out with data flow diagrams what was happening in the business and use that as the basis for saying, okay, so then what parts of that can we automate? And the thing that people forgot about was they sometimes had 4 sets of data flow diagrams showing that transition, whereas the people who were doing it, I think correctly, had 1 set of data flow diagrams that they modified as they went forward. And so that was for sort of an analysis. And the other part of the analysis had to do with data. And about that time, we started having database management systems. And so the whole approach to data went from serial files to random access data. And that was a big change too. And the other thing that happened during that period of time in the 80s is we started having screen interactions with green screens, what they used to call them character-based screens. All you could do was characters and numbers. There was no graphics part of that. Mm-hmm. So those were some big changes during that period of time in terms of the technology and actually how things were developed.
Now, you brought up something interesting, and I had noted it for myself as part of this conversation, because in your book, you speak about 2 major drivers for this evolution in software engineering. One being the advancement of technology, and you briefly spoke about when you started out, it was punch cards, and it took 12 hours when you hit the enter button until something was printed out. So basically that feedback loop was really, really long. And of course, today, if you're programming, you type enter, you immediately get a response, right?
Right.
And the other thing that you speak about was the advancement in management innovation, right? How managers show up. And before we started the recording of this conversation, I mentioned we're going to get back there because I might have a different perspective, or it might be similar based on the interpretation. But now you brought in another thing, which is that initially the products that you were building, those software systems, were supposed to replace internal processes, right? Like accounting, like payroll, like all of that kind of thing. And that's exactly what I see in many organizations. When they speak about digital transformation, it usually has 2 aspects. One is leveraging digital technology to optimize whatever they're doing internally. The other is, and that's usually the second piece that comes up, thinking about new business models based on digital technology. And it seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I wasn't around back then, that in the early years of software engineering, it was almost only the first one, right?
Yes.
And based on that, you probably didn't have to check for, is this solution going to be valuable for a user that we don't know yet, right? Or probably, is it going to be viable for us as a business? Because we're not going to sell it anywhere, so it's not important.
It was all cost reduction. It was all
cost reduction
based on cost reduction. Yes, and I think some people missed a major transition that happened, a major pivot point in the mid 1990s. I mean, we know that's the time when the internet came in and sort of changed things, and the GUI interfaces and object-oriented programming. But I think the thing that often people miss is the huge transition from internal systems to external systems.
Yes.
So all of a sudden now we were doing the second thing that you talked about, which was building systems for an external customer. And when I built a system for an internal customer using a green screen, a character-based screen, the user interface design was horrible because there wasn't much to work with. And so you had people that were internal that complained. That wasn't a big deal. But now you're trying to get clicks from people who are outside the company, and it's a whole different ballgame. And so the last part of the 1990s, people were trying to make this transition as things like client server and internet were coming in terms of the technology. And then for big IT companies, internal IT companies, they were having to deal with huge resources applied to the Y2K problem. And so there were a lot of things that happened in the last 5 years of the 1990s that impacted software development substantially.
Yeah. So let's move to that era, actually. Now, it's around 1990, early 1990s, and a few people start out experimenting with a non-waterfall approach to software development. And there are a lot of different experiments, let's call it them, like XP, right, Scrum, Crystal, whatever. What was your role back then, and when did you become familiar with these ways of working?
Well, at the end of the 1980s, I had been doing a lot of training and consulting on waterfall methodologies and basically monumental methodologies. And I kept hearing from senior IT managers, costs too much, takes too long, doesn't fulfill my needs. And so that was sort of in the back of my mind. And I was also thinking about the fact that this strict waterfall approach was not really how I like to work. I thought back to my time in the Wild West, where I was doing everything. I was doing the analysis, I was doing the design, I was doing the programming, I was doing the testing. I even was computer operator once in a while when things got tough.
So you were a full stack developer before this term was coined.
I was a full stack developer, and the stack was two items long, right? Compiler and the operating system. So there wasn't much of a stack back then. But all these kind of were in my mind. And then I actually got a phone call from Larry Constantine. And he had been approached by Amdahl, which is a big computer manufacturer back there, competitor of IBM's. And they needed somebody to do some consulting work for them. And Larry couldn't do it because he was already working some for IBM. And so I met a guy by the name of Sam Baer, who was a marketing manager at Amdahl. And they were trying to sell this mainframe rapid application development tool. And it was really a very good tool, but they couldn't demonstrate the value proposition, and this rapid development was so new that people didn't know what they were trying to buy, and it was very expensive. So Sam and I developed this iterative approach in which we would go into a client with a small team of Agile developers, and we would get some customer people on the team, and we would develop a system for them in a month in 1 week iterations. And then we would not only give them the software, but we would also provide statistics on how much more productive it was than their old way of doing it. And so we actually were doing 1 week iterations way back then in the early 1990s. And we must have done, I wish I had kept count, but at least 20 or 25 of those projects all over the country. And I can remember one time at a large bank in New York City, we built this system for them that they needed in a month. And then we went to operations and we said, okay, we got this brand new system we'd like to put in for these people. And they said, great, it'll take about 6 months to get through operations. And so we had DevOps problems even way back then, and other issues. But that was something that kind of got me started. And my evolution during that period of time was from rapid application development to my personal form of that, which was radical application development. And then a little bit later, it became adaptive after I learned a lot about complex adaptive systems. In about 1994, 95 or so, I started writing my first book. And as I looked out and I began to search around, I found out about Scrum. I found out about DSDM. I found out about feature-driven development, some of the lean development stuff that was going on. So I started finding out some about some of these people who were doing this kind of work. And I wasn't very well tied into the OO community, excuse me, which happened a little bit later.
Yeah. OO, just for our listeners, is object oriented?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So around 1994, 1995, 96, you get to know some of the other people. And in 2001, you decide to meet. Was that meeting in Snowbird the first time that you came all together?
It was the first time we came all together, but it wasn't the first time we met. So in 1997, I met Martin Fowler in New Zealand. We were both speaking at a conference down there, and I met him for the first time. And he realized that I was doing stuff that was similar to what they were doing with XP on the OO side. And he put me in touch with Kent Beck. And Kent and I, in about 1999, exchanged manuscripts. Neither of our books had been published yet, but I got his extreme programming manuscript and I sent him my adaptive software development manuscript. And we realized that we were, doing similar kinds of things. So Kent had a meeting in 2000 in Oregon, at Rogue River, Oregon. And this was basically a meeting for XP proponents to sort of say, where are we going with XP? And there were a couple of non-XP people like myself who got involved in that, who Ken invited to that meeting. And so I got very close to the XP community for a number of years. And that was, so people at that meeting were people like Kent, Bob Martin, and Ron Jeffries, Ward Cunningham, sort of the movers and shakers of the XP movement, Martin Fowler. And so that was the meeting that kind of preceded the meeting in Snowbird, which was a year or so later that Bob Martin started the ball rolling on that one.
Yeah. Now, in 2001, a lot of people wonder what happened at that meeting. You meet 17 people, if I remember correctly, and you agree on a set of values or principles or however we want to call them. How did that happen? Walk us through that a bit.
It was kind of a unique couple of days. I've never been involved in something quite like that before or since. And it happened at a particular point in time. This idea of light methodologies had just gotten started. And somebody had assigned us the moniker light or lightweight, which Alistair Coburn didn't like very much. He didn't like being called a lightweight. It sounded like a bunch of feeble little men wandering around in the dark. And so we got together, and one of the things that is interesting is we used what was becoming used a lot during that period of time, the open space concept. So we didn't really have an agenda. So when we started, and we didn't have an outcome that we had identified. So we just started and just said, the first day we, for example, kind of went around the room and introduced ourselves and talked about what we were doing and what our methodologies were and what our concepts behind the methodologies were, and went around to all the 17 people and did that. So a good bit of the first morning was just kind of catching up with what each of one of us was doing. And, it's really ironic the way it worked out, in that at some point in there, somebody said, let's talk about putting down some values. And it's interesting and ironic, I think, to realize that 17 techies came up with values that really focused first on people and their interactions and collaboration. These are a bunch of techies, and one of the values speaks to software, and code as being the outcome that you're looking for, or the outcome that you're looking for. But it was more about people and their interactions. And so one of the things that happened is that this meeting sort of mirrored how we thought meetings ought to go in organizations. And what kinds of things happen? For example, you got 17 people who have some similar ideas, but they're also very different people and very iconoclastic and sort of nonconformist and adventurers. And getting those kinds of people together and getting them to agree on something. I mean, I don't think today 17 of us would agree on what day it is. having had some interactions with them, over the years, and have gone our separate ways. But the Agile community, or the lightweight methods community, was very small back then. So Alistair Coburn, when I was writing this book, I talked to Alistair, who's been a friend for quite a long time, and he talked to me about an incident that happened at the meeting that sort of showed how people were listening to each other and trying to understand each other rather than just pushing their own agendas. And so he and Ron Jeffries and Steve Miller had gotten together one time. And Steve was a different kind of guy for that meeting. Everybody was kind of wondering, why is Steve here?
Poor Steve.
Poor Steve. And he walked in, and basically during the introduction, he said, I'm the spy here. I'm the spy from the structured world. And so he and Ron Jeffries and Alistair were sitting together talking about some things, and Alistair saying, we just don't think your stuff is going to hack it. And Steve would say, but I'm doing a set of diagrams, and talked about the different kinds of diagrams he was doing. And then Ron Jeffries or Alistair piped up and said, but that means you're going to have to maintain the code in two different places. You have to maintain the diagrams and maintain the code, and they'll always be out of sync. And Steve said, that's not my intent. My intent is that the diagrams generate the code. And Alistair said, oh, well, if that's the case, our intent is the same. He said, we don't think you can do that. But if you could, that would be great, because the intent is the same. And so there was a meeting of the minds in a way there that enabled Steve to vote for the manifesto, whereas if they hadn't had that kind of conversation, that sort of collaborative conversation, he might not have signed it. So it was a very collaborative meeting, a very listening type of meeting. And at the end of it, Bob Martin made some point he referred to as mushy statements about the meeting and the camaraderie that we had between those people. And he said, that Agile at its core is all about mushy stuff.
So, I mean, the incident that you talk about, right, between Alistair Coburn, Ron Jeffries, and Steve is like a really good description of the very first sentence. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, because each of them had different processes and tools in mind.
Right.
But through the individuals and the interactions they had, the openness that all of them demonstrated, like trying to understand why someone wants something, they managed to all get on the same page. They might still follow different processes and tools, but they all agreed to value this one sentence. Now, you mentioned something. There are two things that I noted down, but I'd start with the first one. You mentioned that all 17 of these people were adventurous. And this quality of being adventurous also is one of those like red lines that goes through your books. Yeah, you refer to yourself as an adventurer. You bring in a lot of analogies from mountaineering, like the climbing that you've done almost all of your life. What kind of role did that play for each of you, and specifically for you? You can talk about yourself best in terms of like really being open to these new things. And you've been in the game for 60 years. You were in the game for 40 years when this agile stuff comes around. What kind of role played this adventurous mindset from your perspective?
Well, I think it has to do with setting goals or evaluating things from the aspect of what am I going to get out of this, and what are the risks involved, and that you've got to have some tolerance for what I call acceptable risk, but not unacceptable risk. But that's not a straight line. And the analogy with mountain climbing, for example, is you don't know about how risky something is until you've had some experience with it. And unfortunately, sometimes that experience is bad before you learn enough to make the next decision differently. But when you're mountain climbing, you're always evaluating the conditions, and that's one of the things I wrote an article early in 1990s about the juxtaposition of my climbing experience and my software development experience. And in the software development, I was doing a kind of a waterfall kind of thing, and I was based it on, I have this plan here, and that plan is very prescriptive, and I want to try to meet that plan. And in my climbing, I'm saying, but I'm always adjusting to the conditions that I find in reality. So in climbing, I'm always adjusting, but in software, I'm sticking to a plan. And it gave me some thinking about that was another one of the things that I took into this whole software development. In fact, I wrote this article, and then in my first book, climbing stories are the first things in several of the chapters. So I used that to illustrate certain points about climbing and managing projects in a very high risk, high speed environment that we were entering into during that period of time. So I used them together. And I actually think I was, towards the end of the book, I talk about some leadership qualities, and that adventurousness is one of them. And I think this idea of setting courageous goals and taking on some risk and being a little bit of a nonconformist, I think you've got to have some of those characteristics in order to be really agile. And I think that's also in an organization. If you can't find at each level of the organization some of these people that are adventurous and nonconformist, you're going to have a real hard time implementing agile.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason this resonated so well with me is one of my uncles, he lives in Australia. He's also a mountaineer, a climber for many years. He educated even young people in learning about this. And when I talked to him the first time about what I do, and it was mainly like teaching Scrum, etc., he's like, why is that new? We're doing the same thing in mountaineering for years, for decades. I'm like, what do you mean? Then he walks me through this. I'm like, yeah, it sounds very similar. And then I read your book. I'm like, yeah, he was right. So, yeah, I think a lot to learn from people that are this adventurous. The other thing that I was talking about when you talked about when you talked about the meeting in Snowbird, you earlier mentioned some of the feedback you received from CTOs or your clients who mentioned, hey, this approach, this waterfall approach that you were teaching, it takes too long, it costs too much, it doesn't work for me. So when you approached or started working using this adaptive or agile ways of working, when you became familiar with XP, when you became familiar with Scrum, did you have these quotes from your customers in your mind and you were like, hey, this could be one way to address their problems, address the challenges that they're facing of costing too much, taking too long, and not working for them?
Yeah, let me back up a little bit and give you an example. So in about 1995, I was approached by a friend of mine who worked for Nike. And he knew that I had been working on this rapid development approach. And he got me an interview with the CIO of Nike to talk about a project that they had that had gone south. They had a project that had taken 18 months, and all they had was a requirements document. And of course, the user VP that needed that system was not very happy that basically nothing had gotten done in 18 months. So I interviewed with the CIO of Nike to talk about my RAD project. And as I've told some other people, my biggest decision going in there was what to wear, because Nike was a very laid-back organization, very athletic. And so I wore just business casual, but I put on my red Nike running shoes. And the VP actually noticed that, and I got the job. I'm not sure whether it's because of the red shoes or because of my process. But it sort of mirrored the changes that were going on back then, the change away from waterfall methodologies, the change in technology that was going from the internal operational system to the external customer systems. And then the culture was changing in terms of a reduction of command control and more networking, more collaboration was going into that. And so I built a system, or helped build a system for Nike And we took 6 months and we did 1 month iterations, and we ended up with a product that they liked. There were a couple of things that happened during that. I did a 3-day workshop, and then we did a joint session with the customer to find out the requirements and a lot of the things you do with Agile projects today, although we didn't call it Agile back then. And I remember the first iteration, we did a customer focus group, a customer review, and the VP sat in. And the IT people were concerned because they really didn't think they had done much in terms of features. They had a few features and a framework, but they were concerned that the VP would think that they hadn't done very much. And the VP got up at the end of that and said, wow, she said, this is really great. I'll never say anything bad about IT again. And the IT people nearly fell over. And so we delivered that in 6 months. But one of the other interesting things, and this sort of shows how different parts of the organization were slow to get involved in Agile or slow to take it up. So we finished the first iteration, and I went to the database administrator and I said, here's some of the data changes we need for the second iteration. And he said, we don't work that way in database land. You give us the data once, we put it up, and that's it. And I said, didn't you sit through my workshop? He said, yes. I said, what about this iteration and the fact that we're going to change things as we go forward and add to it and have to change the data as well as the process? He said, I thought that was only for the software developers. He said, this is not how we work in database land. I said, okay, I've gotten approval to do the project this way from the senior vice president of this particular group. Let's go talk to her. And he sat back a little bit and he said, well, maybe I can figure out a way. And he did. But those are the kinds of things that you ran into in the early years. You ran into problems with linking the database people into it, or linking the testing people into it, or linking the project manager people into it. It was, it took a lot of time to get through to some of those groups.
Jim, I like that you mentioned those were the kind of problems you faced in the early years. We're still facing these problems today. So now let's talk about
I responded to somebody on a LinkedIn thing a couple of months ago, and they were laying out all the myths about Agile. And my response was, hey, those were the myths that came up 20 years ago. Don't you have any new ones?
Yeah. See? Now, let's talk about what happened since 2001, right? The Agile Manifesto, the 17 of you sign it. You put it out somewhere. I mean, it was not the early years, but still the internet was not what it is today. There was definitely no social media. What happened?
Well, it took off, and it took off for a couple of different reasons. And one of the things that I've done in sort of looking back is to ask the question, why has the Agile movement been so successful? And I think that's a valid question to ask ourselves today, because I think we also have to say, where is it going? What are we going to retain from what we've done in the past, and what new things do we need to add? But what is the core of why the Agile movement was so successful? I broke the Agile period into the Agile era into three periods: the rogue team era, the courageous executive era, and the digital era, the digital transformation era. And that really corresponded to how I worked, but also how some other people were working. The rogue team era was identified by the fact that you had teams in an organization that wanted to go Agile, but the organization was basically still waterfall. So teams would get this dispensation to try this new Agile stuff. But it was very difficult, even if the project was successful, to expand it within the organization, because people would say, well, they got all the right people, or they had a greenfield project, or they had a simple project, or they had a small project, or there were all these reasons why it was successful that didn't sell people on Agile in general being successful. I remember Mike Cohn relating an incident to me as I talked to him about the book. He said he went into this organization in 2003 or 4, something like that. And the VP said, yeah, well, I've got 3 Agile teams going on. So Mike went down, talked to the Agile teams, came back to the VP and said, you've got 4 Agile teams. One of them was just sort of hiding, doing Agile, and nobody else knew about it. Josh Karievsky talks about this incident where he had an Agile team that was working and doing very well and been very successful. And, you know, they were in a room, a conference room, that they were doing collaborative effort in a conference room, all sitting around a table. And they had all their documentation on the walls, you know, the cards and the flip charts and all that kind of stuff. And one of the other teams got jealous of what they had done and their supposed good projects, successful projects. And so Josh and his team came in one Monday morning and all their documentation was gone. Another team had stripped it off the walls in protest. So that's the way it went back then. You tended to have smaller projects, like the one I did at Alias Systems. And this was one, for example, that we had a strict deadline. I mean, I've heard, you know, you can't do strict deadlines with Agile. Well, that's just ridiculous. You can and should. It all depends on what value you put on things and what the parameters are that you have to work towards. But this was
how you prioritize.
And how do you prioritize? That's probably the biggest thing is people don't know how to prioritize, whether it's features or projects or portfolios. They want to try to do everything. And so they end up not doing a lot. And so this rogue team period was a very interesting period. And so there was this effort going on, and actually people from the manifesto who were teaching classes and doing consulting for teams. And then there was the organizational track. And so on that track, people were writing articles. So Martin Fowler and I wrote an article that came out in the fall issue of 2001 of Software Development Magazine talking about Agile. And Alistair and I wrote one on that was in IEEE software. So people were writing articles. They were starting to write books. And we started the foundation of the Agile Alliance. And out of that grew the Scrum Alliance and some others. I started the Agile Project Leadership Network. And some other organizations got formed during this period of time and expanded. And that's how a lot of the message got out. In the early days, one of the ways that the message got out was through Ward Cunningham's wiki, which started out to be a wiki about patterns, but rapidly evolved into a wiki about extreme programming and agile development. And so that was sort of the social media of the time.
Yeah. So you mentioned the courageous executives as also one of these eras, right? So you have the rogue teams, courageous executives, and then you have the digital transformation.
Right.
I can imagine that some of those executives read some of the papers that were written, but the sources that you mentioned or the places where those papers were published are like software engineering things, right? Things for maybe CTOs or CIOs would read them, but not necessarily CEOs. Based on my own experience, though, it is super important if you want to have organizational wide agility, which doesn't mean that every team is an agile team. It's important to have those senior executives to buy in.
Correct.
At what point did you see that happening? And what was the need for that?
Well, during the courageous executive era, a lot of the executives, like in one particular case, was a combination of the CIO in the company and the product development manager, who was pretty high up in the company because this was a medical instrument company. And so there was both a hardware and software component. And we worked with them, Josh Karievsky and I did over a couple of years, changing their software development group to Agile, and with the real support and involvement of the CIO. He really understood what was going on and why we were doing it and understood agility. And the other place that people got information about Agile was in a lot of conferences, because there were a lot of conferences, a lot of speaking that was being done by people like myself and Alistair and Martin and a lot of the manifesto participants were doing a lot of speaking during that part of time. And so the CIO of this company informed the product development manager. And what happened was, after about 18 months of working with the software people, the product development manager, who was a director level person in the organization, he decided that for the next version of this new product that they were developing, that they wanted to do it in an agile style. So that included not only software engineers, but hardware engineers and electrical engineers and systems engineers and physicists and chemists. And so we got together and we did a kickoff session. And hardware is a little bit different than software. And integrating those two things together was more difficult. And we had to go do some things a little bit differently than we'd done them before. But they got to where they had a much better integration of this hardware and software, because they did it all in iterations, even some of the hardware development, as much as they could. The problem or the issue with hardware is, at some point, excuse me, you've got to buy hardware, and once you do that, once you decide on the engineering for those pieces of hardware, they don't change very easily, whereas the software does. So that's one of the things we had to figure in. Yeah. So that was a case where we had a CIO who was really on board, and a development manager, a product development manager, who really understood and participated and was involved, and was a real courageous executive, because both these guys were putting to some extent, their reputation and their jobs on the line to do this a new and different way. And they were successful at it.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that hardware was different back then. And I think this is a good time to look at those driving forces of the evolution of software engineering. Because I definitely believe, and you mentioned this in your book, that the technological advancements were one of those driving forces. They were definitely a catalyst in this, right? So from 12 hours till you get feedback to what we have today, right? This is a big game changer. In the field of hardware, we can see the same thing to some extent, right? 3D printing makes it so much easier to get to faster feedback in hardware engineering, to create increments of a product in order to show it to customers, gather feedback from those customers, and all of that. Now, the second thing you mentioned in your book, and also in some of the other interviews that you gave as part of your book tour, unofficial, is the advancements in management innovation. And before we started this interview, Jim, you and I briefly spoke, and I mentioned that I might have a different perspective on this, because I believe that in most organizations, it's been the technology advancement that drives the need for agility, because they have to keep up with their competitors. It's then the teams that start to embrace these approaches of building software or in general products faster. And based on that, you either get or do not get the buy-in from the senior leadership. And if you get that buy-in, and if they're willing to change how they lead the organization, the overall transformation can be successful. But if you don't get their buy-in, probably all of that will not work. Now, this is the observations that I've had over the past 10 to 15 years. How do you look at that, Jim?
As you move up in the organization, the acceptance of Agile has taken longer. So, for example, it's taken longer with project management than it did with developers. Taken longer with mid-level management than it did with project managers. And I think that is the same up until you get up to the C-level suites. However, there are two sources that have been driving agility. One of which is the Agile movement, and the other one has been management theory in general. So there are people that have been writing, like Gary Hamel, who's been writing about management theory for quite some time, saying we have to change. Rita McGrath is another one from Columbia University, who's been talking about a new style of management for quite some time. And so I think the CEO levels are getting that from these kinds of writers and authors and academics. And they're also getting it from articles that have started to come out in places like Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Review. What I think the Agile movement brings to this, that the management in the general management level has been slower, is that we bring a lot of experience on the ground, working with teams, working with project managers, working with first line managers in installing a more agile approach to things. And so I think we have 20 plus years of experience that we can bring to this. And I think in a lot of organizations, the catalyst from change has come from the IT department telling us how and what to do. And I think what's happened at the general management level is they've become increasingly aware of changes in the environment, in the business environment, that are driving them to a different solution, a different way of going about management. And they're looking to Agile and saying, oh, maybe these guys have some ideas that will be about how we do it. So I think it's a back and forth kind of thing, but I think the Agile movement has a lot to offer in terms of identifying what those characteristics of agility are that we need in leaders all the way up the chain.
Yeah, I think it's really valid to mention people like Rita McGrath and Gary Hamel and a few others that are out there that have been writing about more or less the same principles for many years, and also bringing case studies from very interesting companies such as Haier, which Gary Hamel mentioned in his latest book, Humanocracy, which is right behind me. Now, I have a few more questions, and I'm conscious of our time here, Jim. And one question is, you have not been one of the founders or creators of Scrum, therefore you are not biased by that framework. and that's why I want to ask you. I mean, I've asked this question to Jeff Sutherland, and of course he's biased, right? But why do you think Scrum became, at least so far, the most prominent of these agile methodologies?
Well, I think the primary reason, and you have to give them credit for this, comes from the management of Ken Schwaber and Jeff. And that they hit on the formula early on. And you can agree with their formula about the 2-day Scrum Master training or not. I know they've gotten a lot of flack about 2 days of training making somebody a master. But putting that aside, they have extended the reach of Agile a long way that might not have happened otherwise. So I give them and the whole Scrum movement a lot of props. I think at the core, Scrum is about the same kinds of values that you have in the Agile Manifesto. And when I talk to people about this issue, I talk about Jerry Weinberg's law of raspberry jam, which is the further you spread it, the thinner it gets. So the further you spread knowledge about Agile or Scrum or whatever, it's the knowledge is going to get very thin out there on the edges, and there are going to be people who do it wrong. And I think we get a lot of flack from people who have been in an organization. I was talking to somebody not long ago who had been in 3 different jobs, and all those jobs said they were Agile, and they weren't Agile to his specification. And he went to work for a 4th company and found a place that really, he thought, subscribed to the not only Agile practices, but the Agile mindset. And so I think that as you get to the edge of some of these things, you get into problem areas. And you get people who are doing it too strictly. I call them prescriptive agility, which is an oxymoron. You get people that are not doing some of the workplace things that I think are necessary, the empathetic management part of that. So you have various and sundry different implementations. But I think there's some bigger fish to fry than arguing about this kind of retrospective versus that kind of retrospective, or this kind of sprint versus that kind of sprint. I think there's some bigger fish to fry in terms of leadership of the Agile movement, leadership of software development, and then leadership of organizations that need the benefit of more agility to make a place in the world where we've got some big problems to address.
Yeah, absolutely. I refer to those people that you mentioned, prescriptive agilists. I call them agile fundamentalists, which is also an oxymoron, because
Right.
if you're an agilist, right, you can't be fundamentalist about anything, right? So other than maybe continuous improvement, but the way you do the continuous improvement, you can think about and should be flexible about it. The second question that I wanted to ask you as we're ending this conversation, where do you see this whole movement going? What do you, based on your 60 years of experience, what do you project for the next 10 years? Not 60 years, just the next 10 years.
Well, one of the things when I was writing the last chapter of the book, I started to think about predicting things. And I thought, no, I don't want to try to predict where things are going. What I wanted to do is prepare a history so that history helps you prepare for what's coming. It's not trying to predict, but it's trying to prepare. But if I look at the trends over time, I think that I talked about methods, methodology, and mindset. And I think the methods are surely going to change drastically, possibly with the advent of AI. So the methods are going to change. In order to do them faster, and maybe you've got tools that'll do it a lot faster, the agile methodologies may have to change. And maybe you come up with something that's it's called Excalibur, right? It's a new wing-ding artificial intelligence-based methodology. And that's fine. And lastly, you have mindset. And I think that the real issue here is agility, not agile methodologies. So I think agility is going to be the name. It's going to be a characteristic, a quality that's going to endure for a long time, because I don't think the rate of change is going to slow down. So I think the agile mindset is going to be long-term very, very important. And that's where I would like to see efforts go.
Yeah, that's very similar to how I think about this. I was like 10 years ago, I was interviewing someone who wanted to join our company. And she asked me, Sohrab, how long do you think this whole agile thing is going to stay around? I'm like, I think I'm going to retire with this. And back then I was 30 years old. She's like, what? I'm like, and not because I make so much money in the next 5 years, because I really believe this is going to stay. And as you mentioned, the pace of change is not going to slow down. And even if it stays as it is, not increases, but stays as it is, it means that there's still going to be a lot of change. So organizations need to become really, really good at dealing with change, no matter whether they are startups or already existing organizations. And with that said, I believe agility, as you mentioned, as a mindset, as an approach to business, that really is going to stay. And it's going to take a long time for people to get there. Now, Jim, to close this interview, I'm going to ask you one of those questions that I get almost in every single class that I teach. And I'm curious to hear your answer. And that question is, in what kind of projects would you not use an agile way of working?
Well, one of the things that I did in the Agile Project Management book that I wrote, first version was 2004, and the second edition was in 2009. I had a chart in there called the exploration framework. And so what I did is I looked at projects in terms of their risk from both the technology and the requirements. So if you had a real fuzzy requirements and a real new technology, you'd have a higher risk than if you had absolute requirements and a very well-known technology. And I scored it 1 to 10, 10 being really, really high risk and a 1 being really, really low risk. So for example, a low risk project would be a project to move from one building to another, where you know where the rooms are, you know what furniture's got to go where, you know where the computers are going to go. There's not much uncertainty about that. So I could use any kind of methodology for that. With a 10, I better use Agile. And then in the middle, maybe there's some other kinds of process that would work. I think Agile has been shown to work in a much wider set of instances than originally was anticipated. But I think an agile mindset, even if I'm going to do a more structured project, an agile mindset is the way to go, because I think if you have an agile mindset, you can determine when do I have to be more structured and when do I have to be more agile, more so than a person with a very structured mindset can determine when to be agile.
Yes, I fully agree. And that's very similar to the answer that I give. Jim, I want to thank you for two things. One, thank you for taking the time and
You're
being
welcome.
so generous and sharing your insights with us, not only during this conversation, but also writing the book, which was initially intended to be a book for your grandkids. The second thank you is, and that's even more, for all the work that you've done in the past 60 plus years. Because as I mentioned earlier, this is not your first book. And even without the books, just with the work that you did with so many organizations, you worked for many years at ThoughtWorks, you have inspired many people, and you have created, I believe, a much better world for most of the people that are doing product development. So from myself and on behalf of probably many people out there, thank you very much for everything that you've done. And we hope you stick around for many, many more years and we get to learn from you and your experience. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I hope I stick around for a few more years too.
All right, everyone. This is the end of our episode with Jim Highsmith. Bye, Jim.
All right.